So this is my analysis of our music video, which was The Neighbourhood Afraid. The question was, how does our video use, develop, challenge conventions of media products? I think our video definitely does use conventions, forms of media products. The neighbourhood style, for example, like the identity and the indie style, definitely like the way we the filters throughout our video are very indie, for example, and we use for band identity, we use the band's logo right at the beginning of the video. So having that is immediately tells the audience of the band's identity, who they are and what their logo is, and that's also accompanied at the beginning with their song title. So labels sort of require band identity through artists, logos and intertextual references to like other works of the band or the artist themselves. We only use the logo in our video, which sort of challenges the idea of having a band in the video, for example. Like usually band videos usually have a band performance and it's usually quite dark, whereas ours, we just use characters which replace that idea. So that's also challenging that idea that all band videos have the band in, because obviously we don't have the band in ours. We use different characters or actors to represent them instead, and like based on a narrative story instead. So we decided that we'd go with the black and white theme, which is also linking to the brand's identity of black and white, due to the fact that the neighbourhood only work in black and white. Whether it's an interview, they request it in black and white, a magazine advert, their album artwork, merchandising, the whole brand identity is in black and white, so we wanted to stick with that idea. Also, it's quite common amongst indie bands, other indie bands like Arctic Monkeys, The Neighbourhood, 1975 and Bastille. They all sometimes work in black and white, so I think it's quite an indie genre aspect. So to put that in our video was something that we wanted to do, just because it represents sort of the indie culture. Also in our lip syncs we sort of have each character has this attitude about them that they're not really caring, or like they're not very emotive, which is something that belongs to this sort of indie cool vibe that most indie bands or people who are trying to run with that vibe sort of portray in their videos. So that was important to us in that aspect. Going with the artistic direction that we wanted to, with the black and white and the imagery, we sort of develop the indie sort of vibe, because we sort of mash up different elements of mainstream videos and indie videos. So instead of having a video that was just plain imagery, which can be to some people quite boring, we wanted to appeal to a different audience as well, like a mainstream audience that would put it on MTV or something. So we had the underlining narrative through the imagery and through different characters in the video, so that we could appeal to both mainstream audience and the neighbourhood's indie audience. So that was quite important for us to market and appeal to both audiences. Another thing that we challenged in our video was gender identity. We have two female characters in our video and two male characters in our video. Obviously the neighbourhood are a male vocal fronted band, so having the two females lip sync that vocal sort of challenged this idea of gender, which is something that's apparent in the indie scene. So we wanted to have the idea of gender neutrality to a certain extent, which mainstream videos don't usually represent. So mainstream videos usually have the stereotypical love interest for a female character. So unless they're the lead singer, if they're the lead singer or the a solo artist. For females, they're usually there to look pretty, or for a love interest for a guy. They're not necessarily a main aspect of the video that was sort of challenges the original and stereotypical fundamentals of being in a mainstream video. So like our female characters, they don't dress necessarily girly. We run with the idea of themes of drugs and alcohol and things that aren't usually very feminine to some people. So we challenge the idea in that sense, especially with one of the characters' haircuts. It's not necessarily seen as particularly feminine, but we don't run with that idea. So we wanted to keep the gender neutrality quite an apparent theme in our video, because we're the complete opposite of what mainstream videos use females for. And we also, with the male side of it, we see sort of a gender role reversed in our video. For example, the men in our video are seen as very emotive, particularly emotive people, especially with Brad and Lawrence. Situation with the relationship that they're in. They're very much centered in reality to a certain extent. With mine and Brad's storyline, my character's suffering with addiction, with alcohol, and Brad's very much trying to help her get along with that, and you see him sort of go through that, and his emotions are very apparent and very obvious to the audience, and they sympathise with him, which is something that doesn't necessarily belong to the male characteristics in media, and it's the same with Jodie and Lawrence, especially in the montage section. We always see Jodie's back to the camera in that sense, and we're seeing Lawrence's reaction and emotion towards the feeling of someone else something or someone else taking his place in that relationship, and that idea is very apparent, and it's something that isn't represented as a typically male element in music videos or other media products in mainstream media. Surrealism was another heavily influential thing on creating our music video. I study surrealism in film studies, and Jodie has a particular interest in surrealism with her artwork that she does, and Brad also has a particular interest in it. So it was something that we really wanted to include, because we know that it's different. It's not typically something that is used as a mainstream thing, and surrealists and indie indie bands and artists don't necessarily use a lot of it anyway. So we wanted to challenge the idea and sort of develop it and have it in our video. I mean, it was examples of it in our video, for example, is the doll is probably one of the main ones. I mean, it symbolises youth and innocence and childhood, so I think that's something that the neighbourhood themselves stereotypically talk about in all of their interviews. For example, they're always talking about their background and growing up, and they talk about it honestly through their music. So having the doll in there was quite important to us. Again, with the waves and the smoking, there are influences from surrealism, especially The Beach with Maya Deren. Having this idea of being lost or not knowing where to go or where you're going is something we portrayed through the beach scenes in our video. Mainstream media don't necessarily use surrealism in their videos. I mean, they'll use aspects of imagery, because most videos do, but they don't take the surrealist elements as seriously, just because a lot of people don't understand it, so therefore it's not a safe option to go for, because people might not relate to it, or they won't embrace it as quickly or invest in it. So having something that's safe and people know what sells is a safer option for mainstream media to go for. So our video is definitely heavily surrealist influence, so having it be in a mainstream audience might not be as safe, because it's not a safe option. So people like safe, people understand the safe option, so that's why mainstream media don't necessarily use imagery a lot in their videos, because people might not understand it, therefore not investing. Also, our video at the beginning wasn't heavily influenced by a certain narrative, and it wasn't necessarily a characterized narrative either. So we wasn't originally going to have characters in our video, and it wasn't going to be all about the narrative, and it still isn't to a certain extent. It's still a very ambiguous narrative, but we've got heavy influence through surrealism, and we have a lot of imagery in our videos, and that sort of challenges the idea of that Goodwin's talks about as well. So Goodwin talks about this idea that there are certain characteristics that go along with music videos. So for example, bands, in his opinion, always usually have a performative video. So there's a band playing the instruments, the band are being seen, and they're being recognised. Our video sort of challenges that idea a little bit, because we don't have the band in there. There's not necessarily a performance video in there, and yeah, then there's two main types of, well, I'd say two, maybe three main types of music video that mainstream sort of dabble in and use, and that's the imagery / surrealism sort of element that I was talking about, but also the performative element to it as well, and the narrative, so the storyline, which is one of the most common, the performative and the narrative. But we sort of combine all three, which is sort of a weird mashup of different worlds that is easily marketable. So having it on mainstream things it appeals to mainstream viewers, it appeals to indie viewers, and other viewers as well. So it's a very cultural, like, you can invest in it no matter what area you're from. So we use the performative aspect with the lip syncs. So having us lip sync is an element of the performative video. We have the narrative as well, which is something that mainstream videos usually use, and we also have the imagery, which is more of the indie artistic sort of reflection. So combining all three was a really good option for us, because it allows different people to access it and relate to it. Yeah, that's it.